The wind that scoured the Arizona Territory in the winter of 1883 was not a whisper, but a predator. It stalked the canyons of the Chiricahua Mountains, a rabid wolf of ice and air, and its howl was a promise of death to anything left exposed. For Jocelyn Callahan, a widow of 2 years living on the edge of nowhere, that sound was the loneliest sermon she had ever heard. It stripped the paint from her small homestead and rattled the memory of her husband's laughter from the very bones of the house. On the 3rd day of the blizzard siege, when the world had been erased by a fury of white, she saw it a smudge of darkness against the snow, a broken shape that had no business being there. The homestead was an island in a sea of blinding white. Jocelyn Callahan had learned the brutal arithmetic of survival in the 2 years since her husband Liam had been taken from her. She knew the precise number of logs in the woodpile, the weight of the flour sacks in the pantry, and the number of bullets in the Winchester rifle propped by the door. Each item was a bead on an abacus of life and death. Liam had been a strong man, a believer in this land, who had seen promise where she now saw only hardship. The official report from the U.S. Marshals in Tucson said an Apache raiding party had ambushed him on the trail. They'd called it a tragedy. For Jocelyn, it was the end of the world. Now her world was shrinking to the 4 walls of her cabin as the great blizzard of '83 descended. The sky, the color of a lead coffin, had unleashed a torrent that buried fence posts and turned the familiar landscape into a treacherous alien moonscape. For 3 days, the wind screamed its mournful song. Inside, Jocelyn moved with the quiet efficiency of the solitary. She stoked the fire-kneaded dough for bread and cleaned the rifle she prayed she'd never have to use again. On the 3rd afternoon, as a pale, watery light struggled through the grimy window pane, she saw it. Through the swirling curtain of snow, a small, dark shape lay half-buried near the frozen creek bed. At first, she thought it was a fallen calf or a deer, but it was too still. A primal caution, the kind that kept a lone woman alive in this territory, warred with a deeper, more stubborn instinct. Liam had always said, "You don't let a living thing suffer if you can help it, Joss. Not even a snake if it ain't threatening you." She pulled on Liam's heavy sheepskin coat, which still smelled faintly of him, of pine sap and tobacco. She wrapped a wool scarf around her face, grabbed the Winchester, and tied a rope to the porch railing, a lifeline back to her sanctuary. The cold was a physical blow, a thief that stole her breath and turned her bones to ice. Each step was a plunge into a deep, freezing drift. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a boy, an Apache boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, dressed in buckskins that were now frozen stiff. A gash on his forehead was caked with frozen blood, and one of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Beside him lay the carcass of a young cougar, its neck pierced by a crudely fashioned spear. The boy had fought, and somehow he had won. But the mountain and the storm had claimed the victory. Every instinct, every warning she had ever heard from the settlers in the nearby town of Redemption Creek screamed at her to turn back. Apaches were the reason she was a widow. They were the specters in the stories told around campfires, the faceless enemy. The town's deputy Wade Brody, who had taken a particular interest in her welfare since Liam's death, had been clear. "You see one?" He'd said, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "You don't ask questions, Mrs. Callahan. You shoot." Jocelyn looked down at the boy. His face was serene, almost sculpted, his dark hair matted with snow. His chest rose and fell in the shallowest of breaths. He was not a warrior. He was not a spectre. He was a child dying at her doorstep. In that moment, the ghost she was fighting was not the spirit of some feared Apache warrior, but the ghost of her own humanity, which threatened to die in the frozen wasteland of her grief. She slung the rifle over her shoulder, knelt, and with a grunt that tore at her lungs, she carefully worked her arms under the boy's frigid body. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of ice and bone. As she lifted him, a small beaded pouch fell from his belt and disappeared into the snow. There was no time to look for it. Dragging him, pulling him, she fought her way back to the cabin, following the rope, her only guide in the white abyss. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the wind and leaving Jocelyn alone with the son of her sworn enemy. The warmth of the cabin was a shock after the biting cold. Jocelyn laid the boy on a bearskin rug before the hearth, his body so stiff she was afraid he might break. For a long moment she just stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. The boy's skin was the color of pale clay, his lips tinged with blue. His buckskin tunic was frozen solid. Panic gave way to purpose. She worked quickly, her hands clumsy with cold and fear. Using a skinning knife, she carefully cut away the frozen buckskins, revealing a thin, wiry frame, bruised and scraped from his fight, and the fall that must have preceded it. The leg was worse than she thought. The bone had clearly snapped below the knee, a jagged end threatening to push through the skin. She set a large cauldron of snow on the fire to melt for water. She tore strips from one of her own linen sheets, the fine ones she'd brought from back east, the ones she and Liam had used. As she worked, she talked to the boy, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The sound of her own voice filled the terrifying silence. "You stubborn little thing," she murmured, her voice raspy. "Fighting a catamount and then a blizzard. You've got more fight in you than sense." She cleaned the gash on his forehead. As she gently wiped away the blood, she saw the fine, high cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw. He looked nothing like the monstrous caricatures from the penny dreadfuls. He looked like a boy. The leg was the true challenge. She was no doctor. The closest one, Dr. Peterson, was in Redemption Creek, a lifetime away through the storm. She had only set the broken wing of a chicken once. This was different. Rummaging through Liam's old tool chest, she found 2 smooth, flat pieces of hickory. Splints. She took a deep breath, offered a silent, desperate prayer, and gripped the boy's leg. With a swift, brutal pull, she set the bone as best she could. The boy didn't even flinch, his body lost to the cold. She bound the leg tightly between the splints, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knots. For the next 2 days the blizzard raged on, sealing them in their small arc. The world was firelight shadow and the scent of boiling herbs. Jocelyn forced warm broth, drop by drop, between the boy's cracked lips. She sat by his side through the long nights, listening to the wind and the boy's shallow breathing. He was delirious with fever, muttering words in a language that sounded to her like stones tumbling in a riverbed. In his fever dreams he cried out. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the terror. She would place a cool, damp cloth on his forehead and speak softly to him. "Hush now. You're safe. You're warm." She was speaking to him, but also to the frightened, lonely woman she had become. On the 5th day, the wind finally died. The silence it left behind was profound, almost holy. That same afternoon, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they held only confusion. Then, as he took in his surroundings, the log walls, the strange furniture, the white woman watching him, fear flooded in. He tried to push himself up, his eyes darting to his splintered leg, a raw panic on his face. "Easy, easy," Jocelyn said, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe. You were hurt. I found you in the snow." He didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. He shrank back, his gaze falling on the Winchester rifle resting by the door. His eyes hardened. He was a captive. The next few days were a quiet, tense dance of mistrust. He refused to eat the food she offered. He would watch her every move, his expression a mask of stoicism that couldn't quite hide the fear. Jocelyn left food and water by his side and went about her chores trying to appear non-threatening. She showed him the splints on his leg, pointing to the wood and then to a sturdy tree branch outside, trying to explain. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. She was polishing a small silver locket, a treasured gift from Liam. Inside was a tiny photograph of him, smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The boy watched her, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. Jocelyn hesitated, then held it out for him to see. He looked at the picture, then back at her. He pointed to the picture, then to the empty space beside her at the small dinner table. It was a question. "Your man, where is he?" Jocelyn's throat tightened. She looked at the boy, and for the first time, she saw not an Apache, but a child who understood loss. She shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Gone," she whispered. The boy held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with his good hand, he reached into the pouch she had placed by his bedside, a pouch of his belongings she'd found when his clothes had thawed. He pulled out a small, intricately carved bird made of obsidian. He held it out to her. It wasn't a gift of thanks, not yet. It was a gesture of shared sorrow, a fragile bridge built across an impassable gulf. Later that evening, as she ladled stew into a bowl, he pointed to himself and spoke a single clear word. "Nantan." "Nantan," she repeated softly. "I'm Jocelyn." He ate the stew she offered him, every bite a concession, every spoonful, a fragile truce forged in the heart of a merciless winter. The thaw came as violently as the blizzard had. The sun beat down on the snowpack, and the world began to weep. The sound of melting of water running in newly formed rivulets was a sound of release. For Jocelyn and Nantan, it was also the sound of the outside world returning, and with it its dangers. Nantan was healing. The fever was gone, and though his leg was still useless, a flicker of boyhood energy had returned to his eyes. He learned a few English words, water wat or so, fire or good. Jocelyn learned that he was a skilled carver, his hands deft and sure as he whittled a piece of scrap wood into a surprisingly lifelike horse. The silence between them was no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with a quiet understanding. It was a week after the blizzard's end that the knock came at the door. It was a heavy, authoritative sound that made Nantan flinch. Jocelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She gestured for Nantan to be silent, pulling a thick blanket over his makeshift bed on the floor, hoping to conceal him. She opened the door to find Deputy Wade Brodie filling the frame. Brodie was a man who seemed too large for his own clothes, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had been Liam's friend, and since Liam's death, he had appointed himself Jocelyn's unsolicited guardian, his concern always feeling more like ownership. "Jocelyn!" He boomed his voice, overly cheerful, as he stomped snow from his boots. "Just checking on our favorite widow. That was one hell of a storm. Figured you might be running low on supplies." "I'm fine, Wade. I managed," she said, keeping her body positioned to block the view into the cabin. His eyes scanned the interior over her shoulder. "Managed just fine, it seems. You're a resourceful woman." He held up a sack. "Brought you some coffee from the Mercantile. Can't have you going without." "That's kind of you, but you didn't have to." "Nonsense," he said, stepping past her into the cabin before she could object. His presence immediately seemed to suck the warmth from the room. His gaze swept everywhere, missing nothing. He noticed the extra bowl by the hearth, the small wooden horse on the mantelpiece. "Getting into whittling?" he asked, a thin smile playing on his lips as he picked up the horse. "Didn't take you for the type." "You learn new things to pass the time," Jocelyn said, her voice tight. Brody's eyes narrowed. "Smells like comfrey and willow bark in here. Someone hurt." "I bruised my arm during the storm. Made a poultice." The lie came easily, but she felt a flush of heat on her cheeks. He walked around the small cabin, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor, a sound that grated on Jocelyn's nerves. He was a predator scenting the air. His boot nudged the edge of the blanket pile where Nantan was hiding. Jocelyn's breath caught. "You know," Brody said, turning to face her, his tone shifting from friendly to serious. "There's been talk. A Chiricahua hunting party was caught on the North Ridge when the storm hit. They scattered. Their leader, a real hard case they call Gochimin, is looking for his son. Lost him in the storm." Jocelyn's blood ran cold. She struggled to keep her expression neutral. "If you see anything, Jocelyn, anything at all, you know who to call. We can't have them getting bold, thinking they can just wander on to settler land. Not after what happened to Liam." He let the name hang in the air, a deliberate, calculated reminder. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught something on the floor near the hearth, a single tiny blue bead glistening in the firelight. It must have fallen from Nantan's moccasins. Brody stooped and picked it up, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the bead, then at Jocelyn. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He dropped the bead into his vest pocket. "You take care now, Jocelyn," he said, his voice once again dripping with false concern. "It's a dangerous world for a woman alone." He tipped his hat and was gone. The door closed, and Jocelyn leaned against it, her body trembling. The fragile piece of her sanctuary had been shattered. The deputy's shadow now loomed over them, long and dark and deeply threatening. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he would be back. The deputy's visit left a poison in the air. Fear a guest, Jocelyn had finally begun to show. The door was now seated firmly at her table again. She explained the danger to Nantan through a combination of gestures and the few words they shared. She pointed to Brody's retreating tracks, then made a shooting motion with her fingers. Nantan understood. The stoic mask returned to his face, but now it was joined by a fierce, protective glint in his eyes. He was no longer just a patient. He was her partner in a dangerous secret. 3 days later, as dawn broke, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold, Jocelyn saw him. He was standing on the ridge overlooking her cabin, a silhouette against the rising sun. He was as still as the rock. He stood upon a man who seemed not to be on the landscape, but part of it. He carried a lance and a rifle, and though he was too far to see his face, she could feel his gaze on the cabin, a palpable searching pressure. It was him, Gochimin, Nantan's father. Nantan saw him too. He dragged himself to the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill. A single word escaped his lips, a sound of reverence and relief. "Shita, my father." All day the man remained. He didn't approach, he just watched. It was a vigil, a silent testament to a father's hope. Jocelyn's mind raced. Should she take Nantan out, signal to him? But Brody's warning echoed in her ears. A lone woman, an Apache chief, his son. The settlers of Redemption Creek, whipped up by a man like Brody, would not see a family reunion. They would see a conspiracy. They would see a betrayal. That evening, as dusk settled, the man was gone. But the next morning he was there again in the same spot. A silent, patient sentinel. On the third day of the vigil, Nantan made a decision. He had been working for days on a piece of wood. Using Jocelyn's sharpest knife, he had carved a detailed figure of a hawk, its wings outstretched. He beckoned to Jocelyn, his expression urgent. He pointed to the hawk, then to the man on the ridge. He wanted her to take it to him. It was a message: I am here. I am alive. Jocelyn was terrified. To walk out there to approach an Apache war chief was madness, but to look into Nantan's pleading eyes and refuse was impossible. The bond they had forged in the firelit cabin was stronger than her fear. She pulled on her coat, her hands trembling as she took the small wooden hawk. "Stay away from the window," she instructed Nantan, hoping he understood. She walked out of the cabin, her boots crunching in the snow. She didn't carry her rifle. It was a deliberate choice, a statement of trust she wasn't sure she felt. The air was thin and cold. The man on the ridge watched her every step. He didn't move, didn't raise his rifle. He simply waited. The climb was arduous. The snow was deep, the incline steep. By the time she reached the ridge, she was breathless. He stood about 20 feet away. He was taller than she had imagined, lean and powerful, his face a testament to a life lived under the sun and the wind. His eyes were dark and piercing, holding a wisdom and a sorrow that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. There was no menace in them, only an unbearable intensity. She held out the wooden hawk. Her voice was a bare whisper. "Your son, Nantan, he is in my cabin. He is safe. His leg was broken, but he is healing." Gochimin's gaze flickered from her face to the hawk in her hand. He took a step forward and gently took it from her. He ran a thumb over the intricate carving, recognizing his son's handiwork. The iron mask of his expression softened just for an instant, and in his eyes, Jocelyn saw not a fearsome warrior, but a father who had found his lost child. He spoke his voice low and resonant, the Apache words flowing like a deep, slow river. She didn't understand them, but the meaning was clear. He was asking questions. How? Why? She tried to explain with gestures the blizzard, the cougar, the broken leg, the warmth of her fire. He listened, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were reading the story in her soul rather than in her clumsy movements. When she was finished, he gave a slight, formal nod. He looked down at his son's carving one more time, then turned his gaze back to her. He said nothing more. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing over the ridge as silently as he had appeared. Jocelyn stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones. She was flooded with a strange mix of relief and dread. She had returned a son to his father, but in doing so, she felt she had sealed her own fate. She had crossed a line, and she knew there was no going back. The world was no longer simple. There were no longer clear enemies or allies. There was only the man who watched from the ridge the boy healing by her fire, and the deputy whose shadow grew longer with every passing day. A week passed in unnerving silence. Gochimin did not reappear on the ridge. Wade Brody did not return from town. The quiet was a fragile skin stretched over a boiling pot. Jocelyn taught Nantan the English alphabet, scratching letters in the ash of the hearth. He taught her the Apache words for sun, mountain, and friend. The splint came off his leg. He could walk now with a pronounced limp, but the bone was knitting. He was almost ready to go home. The thought left an unexpected ache in Jocelyn's chest. Then one morning, they came. Jocelyn was outside splitting kindling when she heard the sound of unshod ponies. Her head snapped up. On the trail leading to her homestead, a group of riders approached. There were 5 of them, all Apache. They moved with a fluid grace, their rifles held non-threateningly across their laps. At their lead was Gochimin. Jocelyn's hand flew to the small pistol she now kept tucked in her apron. Nantan came to the doorway. his face a mixture of joy and apprehension. Gochimin halted his pony a respectful distance from the cabin, his warriors fanned out behind him, their faces impassive. They were not here for a fight. This was something else, entirely. Gochimin dismounted. He was not dressed for war. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, adorned with intricate quill work and a single eagle feather in his hair. He carried no rifle, only a large folded bundle. He walked toward her, his steps deliberate and measured. He stopped before her, his height and presence commanding. He looked past her into the cabin and saw Nantan standing in the doorway. A brief, almost imperceptible exchange passed between father and son, a look of immense pride and profound relief. Then Gochimin turned his attention back to Jocelyn. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a deep, solemn respect. With great ceremony, he unfolded the bundle he carried. It was a blanket, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. It was woven from fine wool, its colors vibrant and rich, deep indigo, fiery scarlet, and a brilliant sun yellow. The patterns were complex geometric designs, symbols that spoke a language she did not know, but could feel. It was a work of art, a thing of staggering beauty and significance. He held it out to her. A gift. She stammered, overwhelmed. I cannot accept this. It's too much. I only did what anyone would have. Gochimin spoke, and one of his warriors, a younger man with kind eyes, translated in halting but clear English. He says this is not just for what you did. It is for who you are. You saw a child, not an enemy. You showed honor. Jocelyn tentatively reached out and touched the blanket. The wool was soft and warm. The translator continued, his voice dropping slightly. This is a wedding blanket. It is a gift of highest honor. It declares a bond between our people and your house. It says this woman is one of us. She is to be protected. Her home is a sanctuary. To harm her is to harm us. The words hit Jocelyn with the force of a physical blow. A wedding blanket. Her mind reeled. This wasn't just a thank you. This was a proposal, an alliance, a public declaration that would shatter her world. She looked from Gochimin's stoic face to the blanket, then to Nantan, who was watching with wide, hopeful eyes. Suddenly, another sound intruded. The thundering of shod horses. Up the trail from Redemption Creek rode Deputy Brody, and with him a dozen armed men from the town. They reined in their horses, hard dust and snow, flying their faces grim. Brody had clearly been watching, waiting. Well, well! Brody snarled his eyes, sweeping over the scene. Jocelyn standing before the Apache chief, the blanket between them, the warriors watching from their ponies. Looks like we interrupted a party. What is this Jocelyn? Making new friends? His gaze fixed on the blanket, his face already florid, darkened with rage. I'll be damned! A wedding blanket! So that's how it is. You've been harboring his brat, and now you're throwing in with them. After what they did to your husband... The townsmen murmured among themselves, their expressions hardening from suspicion to outright hostility. They saw what Brody wanted them to see, the ultimate betrayal. A white widow consorting with the savages who had murdered her husband. You don't understand, Wade, Jocelyn pleaded, her voice shaking. It's not what you think. Oh, I think I understand perfectly, Brody spat. You've chosen your side. He drew his Colt, the click of the hammer, cocking, echoing in the sudden tense silence. And we've chosen ours. Gochimin. You and your bucks have 10 seconds to get off this land before we open fire. Gochimin did not flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked not on Brody, but on Jocelyn. The blanket was still held between them, a bridge over a chasm that was about to erupt into violence. In that terrifying moment, Jocelyn realized the blanket was not just a gift. It was a choice, her choice. And she had to make it now. The world seemed to slow down. The glint of sun on Brody's pistol, the nervous shuffling of the horses, the cold weight of a dozen hostile glares, all of it pressed in on Jocelyn. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Brody wanted blood. He wanted to turn this misunderstanding into a massacre with her at its center. "Brody, stop!" Her voice was sharper, colder than she had intended. "You're wrong about all of it." Gochimin still hadn't moved. He watched her waiting. His warriors sat on their ponies tense, but disciplined their hands near their rifles, but not on them. They were following their leader's cue, and their leader was watching her. Everything depended on her next move. She took a step toward Gochimin and deliberately, firmly took the wedding blanket from his hands. She didn't throw it down or reject it. She folded it carefully over her arm, a clear, defiant act of acceptance. Not of marriage, but of the honor and protection it symbolized. A gasp went through the posse. "You see," Brody roared, "she's with them. She's a traitor." "No," Jocelyn said, turning to face him, her fear transmuting into a cold, hard anger. "I'm with the truth. Something you know nothing about, Wade." Something in his eyes flickered, a flash of panic behind the bravado. "My husband was murdered," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But I'm starting to believe it wasn't by them." That night the cabin was a fortress under siege. Brody and his men had retreated to the edge of her property, making a crude camp, effectively cutting her off. They were waiting for her to starve or for Gochimin's warriors to make a move. Gochimin and his men had melted back into the hills, but Jocelyn knew they were close watching. Inside, Nantan sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, his boyishness gone, replaced by the grim focus of a warrior. Jocelyn's mind was a storm. Brody's reaction had been too swift, too venomous. His hatred felt personal, and his use of Liam's name. It had always been a tool, a way to keep her dependent, grieving and under his thumb. Not after what they did to your husband. That night, unable to sleep, she went to the old sea chest at the foot of her bed, where she kept Liam's things. She ran her hands over his worn shirts, his books of poetry. And then she found it, tucked into the lining at the bottom, a small leather-bound journal she had forgotten he even kept. She lit a lamp, her hands shaking, and began to read. The early entries were filled with love for her and hope for their future on this land. But as the pages turned, the tone grew darker. Liam wrote about his cattle dealings with Wade Brody, who controlled the beef contracts for the army at Fort Bowie. October 12th, the entry read, "Something isn't right. My tally of the herd we drove to Brody's holding pen doesn't match the payment receipt." He laughed it off as a clerical error, but it's the third time. He's shorting me. He's shorting all the small ranchers. A few pages later, November 1st, I followed the herd after the weigh-in. Brody's men drove a dozen head off the main trail, rebranding them under his iron. He's not just shorting us. He's actively rustling, using his badge as a shield. He's a thief in lawman's clothing. Jocelyn's blood ran cold. She read on her breath, held tight in her chest. The final entry was dated the day he was killed. November 18th, I have the proof. Old man Hemlock, over on the San Pedro slope, saw it too. He signed an affidavit. I'm riding to Tucson tomorrow to give it to the marshal. I'm meeting Brody on the trail this afternoon to tell him what I'm doing, to give him a chance to come clean. Maybe I'm a fool, but he was my friend. I have to believe there's some good in him. Jocelyn dropped the journal, as if it were on fire. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Liam hadn't been ambushed by Apaches. He had been murdered by Wade Brody. The raiding party was a lie, a perfect cover story in a territory already rife with conflict and fear. Brody had killed her husband to silence him, and then he had played the part of the grieving friend, the protector, all to keep her from digging too deep. His obsession with her wasn't concern, it was surveillance. A wave of nausea and rage washed over her. Her grief for 2 years had been a weapon used against her by the very man who had caused it. She looked over at Nantan, at this boy she had saved, the son of the people she had been taught to hate. They were not her enemy. Her enemy had been bringing her coffee and condolences for 2 years. She looked at the wedding blanket draped over a chair, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dark truth that now filled the cabin. Gochimin had offered her protection. She now realized it wasn't just protection from the random dangers of the frontier. He must have known, or at least suspected, what kind of man Brody was. He was offering an alliance against a common threat. The time for hiding was over. She knew what she had to do. She had to get Liam's journal to an honest lawman, and to do that, she had to get past Wade Brody and his posse. She looked at Nantan. She was not alone, and somewhere out in the darkness, she had allies. Dawn broke not with the gentle promise of light, but as a raw grey wound in the sky. For Jocelyn, sleep had been an impossibility. The words in Liam's journal had burned themselves into her mind, rewriting the past 2 years of her life. Her grief, once a pure and holy sorrow, now felt like a cage built by a monster. The image of Wade Brody, his face a mask of false sympathy, his hands offering condolences, while stained with her husband's blood, churned in her stomach like poison. The profound loneliness of her widowhood had been a lie, a carefully managed prison. Rage, cold and diamond hard, began to crystallize around the soft core of her pain. She stood and looked at the wedding blanket, which she had draped over the back of Liam's armchair. In the pale morning light, its vibrant colors seemed to hold a warmth the sun couldn't yet provide. It was a promise of protection, and she now understood its true depth. Gochimin, a man she was supposed to fear, had seen the truth of her situation more clearly than anyone. He had not just offered a gift, he had offered an alliance against a shared enemy who thrived on division and fear. The blanket was her armor. Liam's journal was her sword. She wrapped the journal in oilcloth, the crinkling sound loud in the tense silence of the cabin. She tucked it deep inside her coat, a secret weight against her heart. Nantan was awake, watching her from his pallet by the dying fire. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a solemn understanding that seemed to belong to a man, not a boy. "Nantan," she said, her voice low and steady. "I have to go to the town, to Redemption Creek." She pulled the journal out just enough for him to see it. "This is Liam's words. It is the truth. The people there need to see it." She mimed a book, then pointed toward the town. "Brody, bad man." Nantan's nod was sharp and immediate. He understood more than her simple words conveyed. He rose, his limp now barely noticeable, and went to the cabin door. Cupping his hands to his mouth, he let out a piercingly clear bird call, the cry of a red-tailed hawk. It was a sound she had heard him practice, one she'd dismissed as a boy's game. Now she understood it was a language, a thread of communication, stretching into the wilderness. They waited. The minutes stretched taut and silent. Jocelyn saddled her mare, her movements practiced, and efficient her mind a maelstrom of fear and focus. Just as she finished, a figure materialized at the edge of the woods, as silent and sudden as a shadow detaching itself from a tree. It was one of Gochimin's warriors, the young man with kind eyes. Nantan spoke his name in a respectful whisper, Taza! Jocelyn walked toward him, her heart pounding. She was a settler, a white woman, about to propose a military diversion to an Apache warrior. The absurdity of it was lost in the dire necessity. With Nantan as a bridge, translating her urgent gestures and simple English into the flowing cadence of the Apache tongue, she explained the plan. She needed a distraction, something big enough to draw Brody and the main body of his posse away from the homestead, clearing the trail to town. Taza listened without expression, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He was not just listening to her words. He was weighing her spirit. When Nantan finished, Taza looked from Jocelyn to the armed camp Brody had established, then back. He gave a single sharp nod. The alliance was real. He turned and melted back into the trees as silently as he had come. "I will ride when they leave," she told Nantan, tying the final knot on her saddlebag. "You must stay here. The cabin is the safest place." A stubborn fire ignited in Nantan's eyes. He shook his head firmly, his jaw set. He reached for the spear he had used against the cougar, its stone tip now refashioned and lethally sharp. He looked her straight in the eye and spoke a phrase she had heard him mutter, during his healing, a phrase that felt like a prayer. June Wee. Be a mountain. He would not be sheltered. He would not be left behind. In this fight, he was her partner. To argue would be to dishonor the courage he was showing. She nodded, accepting his terms. They didn't have to wait long. A plume of smoke suddenly billowed up from the far ridge north of Brody's camp. Then another farther down the ridge line. Taza and the others were working fast, creating the illusion of a large war party making a defiant stand. The effect on Brody's camp was immediate and predictable. Shouts erupted. She heard Brody's voice roar with fury and arrogance. "They're making a stand. The nerve of 'em! Let's go flush those savages out, Jackson Miller. You stay here. Watch that cabin and shoot anything that moves." The main body of the posse, a dozen riders, thundered off in a cloud of churned snow and dirt, chasing the phantom army. The two men left behind, Jackson and Miller, took up positions, their rifles trained on the front of the cabin. "Now," Jocelyn whispered. She and Nantan slipped out the back door, moving in a low crouch toward the thick woods behind the cabin. They were halfway to the tree line when Jackson must have caught a flicker of movement. A rifle shot cracked through the cold air, the bullet whining past Jocelyn's ear with a sound like an angry hornet. Another shot splintered the tree beside her as they plunged into the protective embrace of the forest. They didn't stop. They circled wide their feet, silent on the pine needles, until they reached the hidden copse where their horses were tethered. Mounting in a single fluid motion, they urged the animals on, not toward the main trail, but into the treacherous winding canyons Liam had taught her to navigate. It was a dangerous path, but it was their only hope. Nantan rode as if he were an extension of his pony, his small frame anticipating every dip and turn, his spear held ready, his eyes scanning the rocks above for any threat. He was the son of a chief, and it showed in every line of his body. The ride was a frantic, breathless flight. The horses' hooves sent stones skittering down rocky inclines. The wind whistled in Jocelyn's ears, carrying with it the ghosts of Liam's laughter on these very trails. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her gut, but her resolve was hotter. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was an avenger, riding to reclaim her husband's name and her own life. They emerged from the canyons at the edge of Redemption Creek, caked in mud and sweat. The town was agitated, a nervous energy buzzing in the streets. People were gathered in small, anxious groups, talking about the smoke on the ridges and the posse that had ridden out. Jocelyn knew she couldn't just walk down the main street. She and Nantan dismounted, tethering their horses in an alley behind the mercantile. "Stay close," she murmured, and they moved through the back alleys and narrow gaps between buildings, staying in the shadows. Their destination was the one place she felt a glimmer of hope: the office of Dr. Peterson. He was a gruff, pragmatic man who had known Liam his whole life and who valued truth above town gossip. She pushed open the door to his office without knocking, Nantan slipping in behind her. The scent of carbolic acid and old paper filled the air. Dr. Peterson looked up from his desk, his spectacles perched on his nose. His jaw dropped. "Jocelyn, my dear God, what is this I heard? You were besieged." "There's no time," she panted, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She threw the oilcloth-wrapped journal onto his desk. "Liam, it wasn't the Apache. It was Wade Brody. He murdered him. It's all in here. He was rustling cattle from every small rancher in this valley, and Liam found out. He was going to expose him." Dr. Peterson's face, already lined with age, seemed to crumble. He fumbled with the journal, his hands shaking as he opened it to the final damning pages. He read in silence, his breath catching. Finally he looked up, his eyes filled with a terrible dawning comprehension. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I always had my doubts. The wounds on Liam. I was the one who prepared his body. They weren't from an Apache ambush. No arrows, no lance wounds. Just a single clean bullet hole in his back. Too precise. Too cowardly." Before he could continue, the office door crashed open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, splintering the wood. Wade Brody stood there, his face a demonic mask of sweat and fury. He must have realized the diversion was a trick and ridden straight back, his animal cunning leading him right to her. Two of his most loyal men flanked him, their pistols already drawn. "Give me the book, Doc." Brody snarled, his voice a low growl. His pistol was leveled at the old man's heart. "It's over, Wade," Dr. Peterson said, finding a spine of steel Jocelyn had never known he possessed. "Everyone is going to know what you are." "The truth is, whatever I say it is." Brody roared, his composure shattering. "I run this town." He jabbed his pistol toward Jocelyn. "And she is a traitor. Her and this little heathen whelp are going to hang for conspiring with murderers." In that split second, as Brody's attention was on her, Nantan moved. With a speed that defied his mended leg, he launched himself forward, not at the armed men, but at a side table laden with the doctor's medical instruments. With a sweep of his arm, he sent a tray of gleaming steel tools crashing to the wooden floor. The cacophony of metal on wood was explosive, a deliberate shattering sound. It was the signal. The front windows of the doctor's office imploded in a shower of glass. Taza and two other warriors burst through the empty frames in a single fluid motion. They were not wild men. They were a disciplined fighting force. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion, disarming Brody's two stunned henchmen before they could even process the attack. Brody, reacting with the feral instinct of a cornered animal, grabbed Jocelyn. He yanked her in front of him, his arm a steel band around her throat, the cold, unforgiving circle of his Colt's barrel pressing hard against her temple. "Everybody back or the woman dies," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. The street outside, already on edge, erupted. People poured out of the saloon, and the mercantile, drawn by the gunshots and shattering glass. They stopped dead, a stunned audience to the impossible tableau, the town's deputy holding the beloved widow hostage, surrounded in her defense by Apache warriors. It was a scene that defied every prejudice and story they had ever been told. Through the silent, gaping crowd, A path was cleared. Gochimin walked forward, not with the aggression of a fighter, but with the immense, unshakable gravity of a mountain. He stopped his presence alone, a counterweight to Brody's desperate violence. "There is no honor in this, Brody," Gochimin said. He spoke English, his voice calm and resonant, carrying to every corner of the street. "You hide behind a woman because your lies are weak." "Lies?" Brody laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "Ask anyone here. The Apache killed her husband. They're savages. I did not kill Liam Callahan." Gochimin stated his words, cutting through the tension with the finality of a judge's gavel. "My people were hunting many miles south on the day he died. But we saw you, Deputy. We saw your ride from that canyon. We saw you ride out, alone." A shocked murmur rippled through the townsfolk. Dr. Peterson, seizing the moment, stepped out onto the shattered porch of his office, holding Liam's journal high for all to see. "This is the truth," the doctor shouted, his voice trembling with righteous fury. "In Liam Callahan's own hand, he wrote it all down. Wade Brody has been stealing you all blind for years. He's a rustler and a thief. Liam was going to expose him, so Brody shot him in the back like a coward." The crowd's mood shifted with the speed of a prairie fire. The faces turned toward Brody were no longer confused. They were masks of dawning horror and cold, hard anger. He was not their protector. He was a predator who had fed on their trust and their fear. Brody saw the shift. His shield of lies had disintegrated. In a final desperate act of chaos, he shoved Jocelyn violently to the ground and fired a wild shot toward Gochimin. But Taza, ever watchful, was faster. A single precise shot from his rifle and Brody's pistol flew from his grasp. He staggered back, clutching his shattered wrist, howling in pain and disbelief. The spell was broken. The townsmen, ranchers, and storekeeps who Brody had cheated and manipulated surged forward as one, their loyalty to the corrupt lawman vanishing in an instant. They surrounded him, their faces grim instruments of frontier justice. It was over. Gochimin walked to Jocelyn and gently helped her to her feet, his touch respectful. He looked at her, then at Nantan, who now stood proudly beside her. No longer a boy she had saved, but a warrior who had helped save her. Gochimin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture that spoke volumes of love and pride. His gaze then fell to her horse, where the wedding blanket was still draped over the saddle, its colors a beacon in the dusty street. He gave a small, solemn nod. The bond offered in peace and now tested by fire had held. In the heart of redemption, Creek, a new and startling truth had taken root. In the quiet that followed the storm of violence, the truth settled over Redemption Creek like a cleansing rain. Wade Brody was shipped to the federal prison in Yuma, and the story of what happened became a local legend, a tale not of hatred and division, but of courage that transcended boundaries. Jocelyn Callahan never remarried. She didn't need to. The wedding blanket hung on the main wall of her cabin, not as a symbol of a marriage that never was, but as a testament to an alliance that was stronger than steel. She remained on her land, a bridge between two worlds, protected by a bond of honor forged in a blizzard. She was no longer just a widow. She was a leader, a friend, a woman who had looked into the eye of hatred and chosen compassion. Her story reminds us that our greatest enemies are often not those who look different, but those who foster fear for their own gain, and that the bravest act of all is to offer a hand of kindness in a world that expects a fist. If this story of courage, truth, and the unlikely bonds forged in the heart of the Wild West resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of real-life heroism. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden histories and forgotten legends of our past. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive. Thank you for listening.